I wanted to just pause our little look at Romans 7 and 8 as we continue to think about sin and desire and affection. And I wanted to just pick up on something really important. It's just a little question that's bubbling around in my mind. This might be a bit of a speculative sort of leap. And so I want to really sort of pose something as a kind of question, a bit of curiosity, a bit of I wonder if. And I hope that's okay. But I want to pick up on something very important, which is that whilst there is the sense of evil desire, sinful desire, distorted desire in Scripture, there is also a strong sense coming through that desire itself is good, that the affections themselves are good. And so just think about the scriptures that we've seen. We've seen in Genesis 1 to 2 that God made us in his image. And there's that sense of that longing and desire for God. So that in the Psalms we get that famous verse, delight yourself in the Lord and he will grant you the desires of your heart. Desire God and he will meet that desire. We've seen that ultimately it is God that we are to desire. Our affection is for him. We're to love God with our whole heart, our whole mind, our whole soul, and that flows into loving your neighbour as yourself. And then we get into the New Testament and we look at us as new creation, because obviously the fall means that our desire, our affections are distorted, that we have evil desires, evil and sinful affections. But you hit Romans 7, and even in Romans 7, even in the bit where there's the challenge and the wrestling with sin, there is the sense that there is good desire. That Paul's problem is not just that he ends up doing the things that he desires, knowing those things to be wrong, but that Paul ends up not doing the things that he desires and doing the things that he not only knows that he shouldn't desire to do, but in fact desires not to do. So again, there's a sense of positive, good desire, our inability to follow through on those good desires. And I wonder if one of the struggles, one of the tensions we have is around how we view desire, how we view the affections, how we view the passions, whether that is one of the challenges that we face. And I'm wondering that. because I'm aware of some of the theological challenges that there are. Now, when we are thinking about sin and desire and affections, we're really looking at the doctrine of humanity. What does it mean to be human? And those of you that follow all the faith root stuff generally will know that I'm working on quite a big project over time, which is to kind of sketch out a pastoral theology, to go through the whole of systematic theology, but with an applied everyday focus. And I've suggested that there are 4 big questions that our systematic theology, that our doctrine is answering. When I suggested it, obviously this isn't original to me. These are the big 4 doctrinal loci that proper theologians, the big guys, have picked up on, and I heard them first outlined by Mike Ovey when I was at Oak Hill. But the 4 questions are: who is God? Where did we come from? Who am I? And where is the future taking us? Or in other words, we want to think about the doctrine of God, who he is and what he is like, of creation and origins, of humanity, and of new creation. But remember, this again is not new or original to me. This is the start of John Calvin's Christian Institutes. To know ourselves, to do that doctrine of humanity properly, we first of all have to do our doctrine of God right, because understanding what God is like will help us to understand what we are like as his creatures, his creation, as those made in his image. To study us, we first of all have to study him. And so, when we think about God, when we think about desire and affection, we want to first of all think about what it means to talk about God in relation to desire and affection. And that's where we start to delve into what is an incredible doctrine, but I think for various philosophical reasons at times one that gets a bit confused. And it's sometimes referred to as the impassibility of God. Impassibility, or without passions. So one of the big things we know about God is that, a couple of things that we know about God are, first, that God doesn't change. God always is who he is, in nature, in character. That means that God knows everything at once. He knows the past, the present, and the future fully and completely. So God knows everything. And it means that God is outside or transcends, rules over time, that he's not governed by time. He is eternal. That's not just that he is everlasting, that his sort of life is strung out over an infinite number of years, but that time itself does not affect him. And so God has his whole being, his whole life, at once and forever. And so there's no change in his experience. That means that God is not surprised, God is not thrown off guard, God is not thwarted. And so it's starting to link into all of these other doctrines, the doctrine of God's simplicity, that he's not complex, made up of different parts, whether body parts or experiences over time. It feeds into our sense of God's sovereignty, his effortless rule. And key to that is that God is not just without rival, but it's impossible for God to be without serious rivals, because there is no one or nothing outside of him that can confront, challenge, overcome him. And this is the almighty and wonderful and great God that we love and serve, and that helps to give us a feel for what it means to love God. And so that brings us to passions or emotions. That what theologians throughout history wanted to say is, look, you think about you and me and our emotions, our desires, our affections, our wants, what happens? Well, they often tend to rule us, get driven by them. We see that we struggle with them. We can be surprised by our own emotions, our own responses, but also things from outside us stir up those emotions, and we feel we have no choice. We lose our temper. We find ourselves overcome with grief. On the positive side, things cause us to laugh and uncontrollably, even to the point of being hysterical with laughter. And we can find comfort and security in our emotions, or we can struggle and wrestle with our emotions. And you've got the full spectrum, haven't you, of just everyday responses through to disordered emotions, disordered affections. And we see that disorder with things that are actually described as disorders, different from what we might think of as mental health. But we have personality disorders where we recognise that something doesn't seem to be clicking as it should in terms of emotions and affections and desires. We also have addictions where people find that there's a compulsion, that they cannot restrain or control their desires and affections. And then there are the sort of mental illness, mental health issues properly. And I guess depression, but also bipolarism, anxiety, those kinds of things would come into that kind of territory. And what we want to be clear about is that God is not like that. Not least because the worst examples of that come about because of the fall. So we struggle and wrestle with and are overcome and governed by our emotions, our affections and our desires, first of all because we are fallen. God is not like that. And so we say he's impassible, that his passions, his emotions, do not rule or govern him. Now, secondly, there's this little doctrine called the doctrine of simplicity, God's simplicity, that God is simple, not as opposed to complicated, not as opposed to clever, but as opposed to complex. And what that means is God is not made up of different parts so that you could take one part off and he would still be God. Everything that we say about God says everything about God. So when we say that God is love, we don't just mean that he has this feeling, this emotion at particular times called love. And therefore it's not something that's in competition or conflict with God's wrath, with God's anger, or with God's justice, or with God's holiness. When we talk about God's love, it is essential to who he is, but also his holiness is, also his justice is, also his sovereignty is, also his omnipresent, his being everywhere, his infinity and his eternity. They are all essential to who God is. And that means that God is not experiencing different emotions at different times. Remember again, if he is eternal and timeless and all-knowing, that he is not responding to things with a different emotion when he gets surprised. But that is all that we want to be saying through the doctrine of impossibility, that God isn't ruled by passions and emotions. The risk is, though, when we then move from there to deny emotion, feeling, affection, desire themselves. What do I mean by that? Well, some Greek philosophies talked in terms of if there was some kind of deity, then that deity was, I think Aristotle referred to him, it, that as the unmoved mover. And what you got was this division, this distinction between sort of higher life and reality and lower life. And because they were philosophers, they saw the higher life has been about reason and rationality, and they saw the lower life, the sort of the, and that's kind of the spiritual, but the lower life is, so is our base human nature, almost our animal nature. And so emotions, feelings and affections are seen as belonging in that kind of lower nature, that they're beastly. And so we need to escape from them to a place where reason governs all. You notice two things there. One, that the kind of person who is admired is the kind of the stoical person who doesn't have feelings, doesn't show their emotions, the kind of the old kind of English idea of the stiff upper lip, the stoicism. But also it's feeding into what we say about God. And I want to suggest that if we think about God like that, we end up with this God who is cold, unapproachable, and actually lifeless. In fact, you start to, when you look at those kind of philosophical ideas, you start to wonder if there's that much difference between those philosophical ideas of divinity and atheism, because this kind of God is an impersonal God. When you look at Scripture, you see a God who loves, a God who is angry at sin, a God who grieves, over evil. And a God who laughs at the futility of human rebellion as well. I think that's Psalm 2, isn't it? A God who is joyful. And at times the temptation, influenced by that kind of philosophical thinking, is to minimize those things and just say they are anthropomorphic. They are just using sort of human words and ideas to say something to help us understand a bit about God's will, whilst distinguishing out that God doesn't really have that emotion of love, that emotion of happiness, that emotion of anger. We're just using human words about emotion. And there's a sense in which we do have to be clear that when we use those words to describe God, we are speaking as finite human beings. We're trying to find words to describe the infinite God. And so we do want to say that there isn't an exact overlap, exact fit between the two. But my concern is that when we do that, we limit and restrict God. And again, it starts to make those things look negative. And things to be escaped from. If we're going to be more Christ-like, if we're going to be more holy, if we're going to be like God, to image God, then the impression we can give is that we have to escape from our emotions. But that's not the sense I get through Scripture. The sense I get through Scripture is that this God is not, that it's not that he has less than those things that we describe as human emotions, but that God has more than that. God is maximally alive, that God is fully and supremely and wonderfully joy and compassion and love. That God's affections are there forever and eternity. And that God's affections are fully and eternally satisfied. That, as John Piper says, that when we think about that summing up of the chief end, the chief purpose of humanity, to glorify God and enjoy him forever, we realize that God himself, his purpose, his end, his goal is to glorify himself and enjoy himself forever. God desires God, and that desire is granted. Now, I'm just wondering if, I'm not saying this is definitely a full and tight and clear description of everything here, but I just wonder if that kind of thinking can start to influence and come into our approach to questions about desire and questions about affection. That we're at risk at times of over-distinguishing and minimalising, not just for God, but for ourselves as well, the goodness of those affections. Because that will affect our worship, it will affect our experience of life, and then it will affect our pastoral care as well. So, as I said, I'm throwing this out, I kind of a wonder if, let's get thinking about, I would love to hear back from you. Please put some comments in, please message me directly, privately, if you want to sort of flesh out and think things through. I'm really throwing this out there to just try and keep us thinking, keep us talking, try to get to the heart of this this anatomy of our desire and our affections. Thanks.